In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about types of reproductive isolation. There are several different types of reproductive isolation, so we will go through, if I remember correctly, it's 7 or 8 of them, and they can all lead to one specific thing if they last long enough. First off, let's start to define this. I am using page 35 in your packet as your note sheet. If you choose to take notes regularly just off of this video, that's fine, but there is a note sheet in your packet on page 35 for this lecture. Reproductive isolation prevents mating or the production of fertile offspring. In one way or another, either reproduction between two species or between close species isn't going to happen for various different reasons that we will go through, or whatever offspring they do create, if that is possible, you have infertile production. If gene flow between two populations stops, then a new species can arise. If I can keep two populations apart from one of these methods, if I keep them apart long enough, they will become two very different species. And they can no longer mate, and they will also have very different lifestyles usually too. The first type of reproductive isolation that we are going to talk about is geological isolation. This one is simply when the physical separation, or is the physical separation between members of the population. This can happen when the original habitat is divided by land or water. So say the supervolcano does erupt. You have now wiped out a good chunk of that habitat, and whatever happens to be last has the option to kind of recolonize that area. But you're going to have vast expanses of land that cannot be lived on for a while because it has no food, its water is contaminated. You've got to wait until the earth kind of fixes itself before land that was destroyed by lava or ash can be inhabitable again. So say I had, a wolf population that lived in Yellowstone. Because of the supervolcano, this population got split in half. Over time, they're going to accumulate different mutations, different variations that could lead to two very different species to come out of this. Where originally you had one, because they've become separated, and depending on how long that lasts, you could develop two very different species of wolf that can no longer mate with each other for various different reasons. So what happens with this is part of the population colonizes new lands. An example of this are the Galapagos Islands that Darwin loved so much, and so do many evolutionary biologists. This is how we eventually gave rise to the different tortoises that we talked about, depending on their shell shape. They probably started out as one unique population, but maybe one or two of the islands got split up. They became farther apart, so the turtles couldn't swim from one island to another. So now the populations have been separated, and over time they accumulate their own variations, their own unique mutations that prevent them from being the same population. The second type of reproductive isolation is called temporal, or you can think of it as seasonal isolation. What this is when mating occurs at different times, so maybe times of day, something like that, or different seasons. What this means is they can't mate with each other. An example of this is two different populations of frog. You have the wood frog and the leopard frog. If you look at this graph right here, the wood frog mates from March 1st to April 1st. You do have some overlap, so you will find that maybe some frogs from each population could possibly mate, but their peaks of their mating seasons are at different times. So the majority of the time, this interpopulational breeding is not going to happen, even though there is the chance because you do have some of that overlap. Third type of reproductive isolation is behavioral isolation. This is when populations have different mating or courtship rituals, and this gives rise more to like a sexual selection. Examples of this. In the picture that I'm showing you right now, you have some of the different mating songs of different species. A bullfrog is not going to find the mating call of a bird all that appealing. Just like us as humans, we're not going to find the mating call of a cricket very alluring. So you have this sexual selection going on where the mating rituals or courtship rituals of a specific species, of a specific population, don't have an effect on a counterpart or a different species. So you're not going to have any interbreeding or any crossbreeding between different species. Another picture that I will show you have to do with a type of bird, and they have a very elaborate dance routine that they do, that the male has to do in order to attract a female. Most other birds are not going to find this interesting, and so they will not pay attention to it. They don't find it very sexy, and so it makes no difference to them. The fourth type of reproductive isolation is ecological isolation. This is when habitats differ, even when species live in the same region. Because the habitats are different, this prevents species from mingling. It keeps them separate. They don't inhabit the exact same kind of niche within the environment. Examples of this are lions and tigers. Yes, they live in roughly the same area, but they live in very different habitats and they keep to themselves. Yes, you can create a liger. However, most ligers are created within zoos where you have people doing artificial selection. Ligers very rarely happen in the natural world because these species are very different. Yes, they're within the cats, but they are two very separate populations and they don't inhabit the same habitat. So there is no cross-mingling typically. The fifth type of reproductive isolation is mechanical isolation. This is when species or populations cannot physically mate. Basically, what this means is the important parts don't fit. Best example of this that I know you guys will click onto really fast is if you try to get a Saint Bernard to mate with a Chihuahua. This don't work. Their important bits, their important parts for males and females do not fit together. And so you cannot get a mating from this. If you wanted to create an offspring between a Saint Bernard and a Chihuahua, you're going to have to do it within a lab. You're going to have to basically do in vitro fertilization. And it would have to be that the Saint Bernard was mama, because mama Chihuahua wouldn't work. The body would reject that because the puppy, the baby, would be too big for that population of dog. The sixth reproductive isolation is gametic isolation. This has to do with the gametes. So this is when gametes of different species can't interact. What this basically means is a viable zygote cannot be created. An egg and a sperm from two different species are not going to come together and make a fertilized egg, a zygote. It just isn't going to happen. The last reproductive isolation is sterility isolation. This is when offspring of a unique cross between two closely related species cannot produce fertile offspring of their own. Best example of this is when you take a horse plus a donkey to get a mule. Mules are sterile. They are not capable of producing offspring on their own. A horse and a donkey can mate, but their offspring, the mule, is a completely sterile offspring, and you will not get any offspring of the mule's own after this cross. So you come to a dead end. That concludes your lecture on reproductive isolation. So I will stop it right here, and I will see you in class.